Some wounds never heal, no matter how many years pass. For 22 years, schoolteacher Cora Elwood has lived with a broken heart, hiding from love and touch in the dusty town of Dust Creek. Her quiet world shatters when a bleeding stranger, named Dallas, bursts into her schoolhouse, running from men who want him dead. She orders him out, but Dallas has something that changes everything. He carries a letter from her dead fiancé, buried in an outlaw's saddlebag for over 2 decades. What words could a dying man write that would shake a woman's carefully built walls? As fear meets memory, 2 broken souls face truths they never expected. What could possibly be written in a letter that was never meant to be found? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Dust Creek's main street, illuminating the weathered facades of buildings that had seen better days. Once a thriving cattle town, the settlement now held fewer than 200 souls, most of them stubborn, enough to weather the economic storms that had driven their neighbors to seek fortune elsewhere. The railroad had bypassed them 15 years ago, leaving Dust Creek to survive on ranching, determination, and the occasional passing traveler who mistook it for somewhere important. Cora Elwood stood at the window of her one-room schoolhouse, watching the dust devils dance across the empty lot where the old mercantile used to stand. At 47, she carried herself with the practiced composure of someone who had learned to control every aspect of her world, every gesture measured, every emotion carefully contained. Her auburn hair, now streaked with silver, was pulled back in the same neat bun she'd worn for over 2 decades. Her dress, a sensible brown wool that had seen many washings, hung loose on her thin frame. The schoolhouse itself reflected her careful nature. Every desk sat in perfect alignment, each slate clean to spotless clarity. Books stood in orderly rows on handmade shelves, their spines arranged by subject and size. The walls bore maps of the world beyond Dust Creek, mathematical tables, and samples of exemplary penmanship. In the corner, a small wood stove waited for winter's return, its chimney pipe carefully maintained and free of rust. But it was the pressed wildflower in her Bible that truly captured the essence of Cora's existence. A delicate prairie rose, now brown and brittle with age, marked the pages containing the 23rd Psalm. Thomas Whitmore had given it to her on a spring morning 23 years ago, when the world had seemed full of possibility and love. Felt like something that would last forever. She had pressed it that very day, never imagining it would become a shrine to a future that never came to pass. The sound of children's voices broke her reverie. 8 students between the ages of 6 and 14 filed through the door, their morning chatter filling the room with life. These were the children of families too rooted to leave, too proud to give up on their patch of prairie. Cora knew each of them as well as her own family, which they had become in many ways. "Good morning, Miss Elwood," they chorused, hanging their hats and lunch pails on wooden pegs by the door. "Good morning, children. Please take your seats. We'll begin with arithmetic today." Little Sarah Patterson, the storekeeper's youngest daughter, raised her hand. "Miss Elwood, my mama says there's been strangers asking questions in town. Should we be worried?" Cora's hand stilled on the chalk she had been reaching for. News traveled fast in a small town, especially news that might bring trouble. "What sort of questions, Sarah?" "About outlaws and such. Mama told me not to wander far from the store." Before Cora could respond, 10-year-old Billy Morrison, the sheriff's son, piped up. "My pa says they're bounty hunters, looking for someone. Dangerous." The word dangerous hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Cora had spent 22 years creating a world where danger was theoretical, where the worst threats were scraped knees and failed arithmetic tests. The children looked to her for reassurance, their faces reflecting the trust that came from years of her steady presence in their lives. "I'm sure your fathers will handle any concerns," she said, her voice carrying the calm authority that had guided hundreds of students through their lessons. Our job is to focus on learning. Now, who can tell me what 7 times 8 equals? But even as she guided them through their multiplication tables, Cora's mind drifted to the past. Dust Creek had known real danger once, during the Range War that had torn the territory apart. She remembered the sound of gunfire in the distance, the way people had looked over their shoulders when walking to the general store, the constant fear that violence might spill into their quiet streets. It was that war that had taken Thomas. Thomas Whitmore had been everything a young woman could want in a husband. Tall and strong, with gentle hands and a quick smile. He had worked the Patterson Ranch, saving every penny toward the small spread he planned to buy north of town. Their courtship had been proper and sweet, chaperoned visits on the front porch, walks to church on Sunday mornings, stolen moments of conversation after town meetings. She remembered the night he had proposed, kneeling in her father's parlor with a simple gold ring that had belonged to his grandmother. "Cora," he had said, his voice thick with emotion, "I know, I don't have much to offer yet, but I promise you a good life, a safe life, children and a home where you'll never want for anything that matters." The engagement had lasted 6 months. 6 months of planning a wedding, of collecting household items and dreaming about the future. 6 months of happiness that seemed too good to be true, and it was. The Range War had started over water rights, as these things usually did. The big ranchers wanted to expand their operations. The small homesteaders fought to protect their claims. What began as angry words in the saloon escalated to midnight raids and burning barns. Thomas had tried to stay neutral, but neutrality became impossible when the violence reached Dust Creek itself. The day he died, Thomas had ridden out to stop. A confrontation between the Patterson hands and a group of rustlers who'd been terrorizing the smaller ranches. Cora had begged him not to go, had actually grabbed his arm as he prepared to mount his horse, a shocking display of physical contact that went against every rule of proper behavior she had been raised to follow. "Please," she had whispered, her fingers clutching the wool of his coat sleeve. "Let someone else handle this. Let the sheriff—" "Cora, darling," he had said, gently prying her fingers loose. "Sometimes a man has to stand up for what's right. I'll be back before supper. We'll sit on the porch and watch the sunset, just like we planned." He had kissed her forehead, mounted his horse, and ridden toward what would become his grave. The details of his death had come to her in fragments over the following days. An ambush in Devil's Canyon. 3 men against 1. Thomas had gotten 2 of them before the third put a bullet in his back. His body was brought back draped over his saddle, his face peaceful in death, his blood staining the dust of the street where children now played. That was when Cora had built her walls. The funeral had been well attended, with half the territory coming to pay their respects to a good man taken too soon. But after the last mourner had gone home, after the last casserole dish had been returned, Cora had made a decision that would shape the rest of her life. She would not risk her heart again. She would not allow herself to be vulnerable to that kind of pain. She would live, but she would live safely. Teaching had been her salvation. Children needed guidance, and she could provide it without risking her heart. She could nurture and care without opening herself to the devastating loss that came with adult love. For 22 years, this arrangement had served her well. She was respected in the community, valued for her dedication, and pitied in a gentle way that didn't intrude on her carefully constructed solitude. "Miss Elwood," young Tommy Henderson's voice brought her back to the present. "Are you feeling poorly? You look sort of pale." Cora touched her cheek and found it warm. She had been lost in memory longer than she realized, and the children were staring at her with concern. This was unlike her. She prided herself on never letting personal matters interfere with her teaching. "I'm perfectly fine, Tommy. Thank you for your concern. Now, let's move on to geography. Can anyone find Montana Territory on the map?" The afternoon progressed with the familiar rhythm of lessons and recitations. Cora guided her students through their studies with practiced ease. But underneath her calm exterior, an unfamiliar restlessness stirred. Perhaps it was the talk of strangers in town, or the way the spring air carried scents that reminded her of that long-ago time when the future had seemed bright with possibility. As the day wore on, she found herself stealing glances at the window, watching the road that led into town. There was no reason to expect trouble, but something felt different about this day. Something in the quality of the light, or the way the wind moved through the cottonwoods, suggested that change was coming to Dust Creek. At 3:30, she dismissed the children for the day, watching them scatter toward their homes with the casual fearlessness of youth. Sarah Patterson ran toward her mother's store, her lunch pail banging against her leg. Billy Morrison headed for the sheriff's office, probably hoping to hear more about the mysterious strangers. The others dispersed to various corners of the town, their voices fading as they disappeared around buildings and down side streets. Alone in her schoolhouse, Cora began her evening routine. She erased the chalkboard, stacked the slates, and arranged the books for tomorrow's lessons. These simple tasks usually brought her comfort, but tonight they felt mechanical, performed by habit rather than intention. She had just settled at her desk to review the next day's arithmetic problems when she heard it, the thunder of hoofbeats approaching fast. Not the leisurely pace of someone heading home from work, but the urgent rhythm of riders pushing their mounts hard. The sound grew louder, accompanied by shouts and the sharp crack of gunfire. Cora's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She knew that sound, had heard it in nightmares for over 2 decades. It was the sound of violence coming to call, of the careful peace she had built around herself about to be shattered by forces beyond her control. The hoofbeats were almost upon the schoolhouse now, and through the window she could see a lone rider bent low over his horse's neck, blood streaming from his left shoulder. Behind him, perhaps a quarter-mile back, 3 more riders pursued with grim determination. As she watched in frozen horror, the wounded man pulled his mount to a sliding stop in front of her schoolhouse and half fell, half leaped from the saddle. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and several days' worth of beard stubble. His shirt hung in tatters, revealing a chest crisscrossed with scars and fresh wounds. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, their eyes met through the window. His were grey as storm clouds, filled with pain and something that looked like recognition. Then he was moving toward her door, and Cora's carefully ordered world was about to change forever. The schoolhouse door exploded inward with a crash that sent books tumbling from their shelves. The wounded stranger staggered across the threshold, his massive frame filling the doorway like a dark storm cloud. Blood dripped from his shoulder. Onto the clean pine floor Cora had swept not an hour before. "Please," he gasped, pressing his back against the door and sliding the heavy wooden bar into place. "They're coming." Cora shot to her feet, her chair clattering backward. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was certain he could hear it. 22 years of careful isolation, of building walls around her heart, and now this giant of a man bleeding in her sanctuary, bringing violence and chaos into the one place where she felt safe. "Get out," she whispered, then louder. "Get out! You have no right." "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but—" He turned toward her and she saw his face clearly for the first time. Strong jaw shadowed with dark stubble, a nose that had been broken at least once, and those storm-grey eyes that seemed to see too much. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his cheekbone, old and white against sun-darkened skin. "Please." "Don't touch me!" The words burst from her lips in a panic. She pressed herself against the wall, as far from him as the small room would allow. "Please, just leave. Whatever trouble you've brought, I want no part of it." The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by harsh voices and the jingle of spurs. The stranger, Dallas, though she didn't know his name yet, winced as he pressed his wounded shoulder against the door. "Can't do that, ma'am, not yet." His voice was deep and rough, like gravel over stone. "Name's Dallas Kane. I'm not here to hurt you, but those men outside, they surely will if they catch me." I don't care what your name is, Cora said, though. Her voice shook. This is a schoolhouse, a place of learning and peace. You have no right to bring your troubles here. Dallas looked around the room, taking in the neat rows of desks, the carefully arranged books, the maps and charts on the walls. His gaze lingered on the small personal touches, a vase of wildflowers on her desk, a daguerreotype of her parents on the windowsill, the well-worn Bible open to a marked page. "You're the teacher," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Cora Elwood." She froze. "How do you know my name?" Instead of answering, he reached into his shirt pocket with his good arm and withdrew something that made her world tilt on its axis. A letter, yellowed with age, the wax seal cracked but still intact. Her name was written across the front in handwriting she recognized as surely as her own heartbeat. Thomas's handwriting. "That's impossible," she breathed. "Thomas Whitmore has been dead for 22 years. "Yes, ma'am, I know. I was there when he died." The words hit her like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of a student's desk to keep from falling, her knuckles white against the wood. "You're lying." "I wish I was." Dallas shifted against the door as the voices outside grew closer. "He gave this to me with his last breath, made me promise to bring it to you if anything happened to him." "No." Cora shook her head violently. "No? That's not... He never mentioned you. He would have told me if he'd sent someone. He didn't send me. I was hunting the men who killed him." The confession hung between them like smoke. Cora stared at this stranger who claimed to have witnessed the most devastating moment of her life, who carried with him a letter from the grave that couldn't possibly exist. "You're a bounty hunter," she said, the pieces falling into place. "That's why those men are chasing you." Was a bounty hunter. Been a lot of things since then. He glanced toward the window as shadows moved past outside. "Right now I'm just a man trying to keep a promise he should have kept 22 years ago." The letter seemed to pulse in his hand like a living thing. Cora found herself taking a step toward him before she caught herself, pressing back against the wall with renewed determination. "I don't believe you. Thomas would have, if he had time to write a letter, he would have. He wrote it the morning he died," Dallas said quietly. "Sitting by the campfire, knowing he was riding into an ambush. He knew it was likely a trap, but he went anyway, called it his duty." "Stop." The word came out strangled. "Please, just stop." "He loved you, talked about you the whole time we rode. Together. About the house he was going to build, the children you'd have, the garden you'd plant behind the kitchen. He carried your picture in his watch." Cora's hand flew instinctively to the chain around her neck, where Thomas's ring still hung against her heart, the ring he'd never lived to see her wear as his wife. Outside, the voices grew clearer. Rough men discussing strategy, deciding whether to search the buildings or wait for their quarry to make a mistake. One of them suggested burning the schoolhouse to flush out whoever might be hiding inside. "They'll kill you," Dallas said matter-of-factly. "These aren't lawmen. They're hired guns and they don't leave witnesses." "Then why did you come here?" Cora demanded. "Why bring this trouble to my door?" "Because I've been carrying this letter for 22 years, and I'm tired of running from ghosts." He held up the envelope, and in the afternoon light streaming through the window, she could see it was real. The paper aged and fragile, the ink faded but still legible. "He died believing you'd read his words. I aim to see that you do. I don't want to read it." The confession burst from her before she could stop it. "Don't you understand? I've spent over 20 years building a life without him. I've found peace. I don't want to open old wounds. Some wounds don't heal by ignoring them." The wisdom in his words cut deep, but Cora pushed it away. She had survived by not thinking about what might have been, by focusing on what was real and manageable. A letter from Thomas would destroy everything she'd built. "Miss Elwood," a voice called from outside. "You in there?" Cora recognized Sheriff Morrison's voice and felt a wave of relief. "Sheriff Morrison, thank goodness." "Don't," Dallas said sharply. "Look at his shadow on the wall. See how his hand rests on his gun. That's not the stance of a man planning a rescue." Cora looked and saw what he meant. The shadow on the wall showed a man ready for violence, not law enforcement. They got to him, Dallas continued quietly. Bought him or threatened him. Either way, he's not here to help. That's impossible. I've known Sheriff Morrison for 15 years. He baptized his youngest in this very schoolhouse when the church roof was being repaired. Money or fear makes men do things they never thought they would. As if to prove his point, Sheriff Morrison's voice came again, harder now. We know you're in there. Come out peaceful, and nobody gets hurt. But if you make us come in after you, the unfinished threat hung in the air. Cora felt the last of her certainties crumble. If she couldn't trust Sheriff Morrison, if even the law had been corrupted by whatever forces pursued this stranger, then her safe little world was already gone. Dallas held out the letter again. One way or another, your peaceful life is over. The only question is whether you'll face what's coming with the truth or keep hiding from it. Cora stared at the envelope, at Thomas's handwriting spelling out her name in careful script. Her fingers itched to take it, to finally know what her dying fiancé had wanted to tell her. But taking that letter meant opening a door she'd kept locked for over 2 decades. Time's up, Sheriff Morrison called out. We're coming in. The sound of splintering wood filled the air as someone began working at the door with an axe. Dallas winced as the impacts jarred his wounded shoulder, but he didn't move away from the barrier. Choose, he said, his grey eyes meeting hers. Hide from the truth or face it. Cora looked at the letter, at this wounded stranger who claimed to carry 22 years of secrets, at the shadows moving outside her windows like wolves circling prey. Everything she'd built was crumbling anyway. Perhaps it was time to stop. Running from the past, with shaking hands, she reached for the letter. The axe blade bit deeper into the door with each strike, sending splinters flying across the schoolroom floor. Cora's fingers closed around the letter, and she felt 22 years of careful control slip away like sand through an hourglass. The paper was soft with age, worn smooth at the edges where someone, Dallas, had handled it countless times. Not here, she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. If I'm going to read this, it won't be while they're breaking down my door. Dallas nodded toward the back of the schoolhouse. They're a way out through there. The root cellar. It connects to the old mine shaft that runs under the hill. She tucked the letter into her dress pocket, her hands shaking only slightly. The children use it sometimes to hide when storms come through. Can you get to it without being seen? Yes, but... She looked at his wounded shoulder, at the blood still seeping through his torn shirt. You need medical attention. That wound could fester. I've had worse. He winced as another axe blow shook the door. Ma'am, we need to move. Cora grabbed her medical kit from the supply cabinet, a wooden box containing basic supplies she kept for playground injuries. Then she led him to a narrow door hidden behind a bookshelf filled with primers and readers. The door opened onto a steep set of wooden steps descending into darkness. Stay close, she whispered. The steps are uneven, and there are support beams that hang low. They descended into the musty coolness of the root cellar, where shelves lined the walls holding preserved vegetables and emergency supplies. A lantern hung from a hook near the entrance, and Cora lit it with a sulphur match, casting dancing shadows on the earthen walls. Behind them, they heard the door finally give way, followed by heavy boots on the schoolhouse floor and muffled curses as the intruders realized their quarry had escaped. This way, Cora said, leading him deeper into the cellar to where an opening in the far wall revealed the entrance to the old mine shaft. The tunnel beyond stretched into darkness, cool air flowing from its depths. They moved through the tunnel for several minutes before Cora stopped at a wider chamber carved from the rock. Here, previous generations had stored mining equipment and supplies. Wooden crates and rusted tools created natural barriers, and a small underground spring provided fresh water. We should be safe here for a while, she said, setting the lantern on a wooden crate. Let me look at that shoulder. Dallas started to protest, but she was already opening her medical kit. Sit, she commanded in the same tone she used with unruly students. To her surprise, he obeyed without argument, lowering himself onto a crate with a suppressed groan. Up close, she could see the full extent of his injuries. The bullet had passed through the meat of his shoulder, missing bone, but tearing muscle. Dried blood crusted his shirt to the wound, and fresh blood still seeped from the edges. "This will hurt," she warned, reaching for the torn fabric. "Everything hurts," he replied matter-of-factly. As she carefully peeled away his shirt, Cora tried not to notice the breadth of his shoulders or the network of scars that crisscrossed his chest and back. This was a man who had lived a hard life, who had known violence as intimately as she knew her multiplication tables. "You said you were there when Thomas died," she said, focusing on cleaning the wound to avoid meeting his eyes. "Tell me what happened. You sure you want to know?" "No, but I need to know." Dallas was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the lantern light. Finally, he spoke. "I was tracking the Garrett gang. 3 brothers who'd been terrorizing homesteaders from here to Colorado. They'd hit a ranch near Billings, killed a family of settlers, made off with their cattle and horses. There was a bounty on their heads, dead or alive." Cora dabbed antiseptic on the wound, and he hissed through his teeth but didn't pull away. "I'd been following them for 2 weeks when they showed up in Devil's Canyon. Your Thomas was already there, trying to negotiate with them, trying to convince them to leave peaceful like—" "That sounds like Thomas," Cora said softly. "He always believed people could be reasoned with." "Good man, wrong situation." Dallas's voice carried old regret. "The Garretts weren't interested in talking. They wanted to make an example, show folks what happened to anyone who stood against them." She pressed a clean bandage against the wound, and he caught her wrist gently. His hand was large and calloused, surprisingly warm. "You don't have to hear this." "Yes, I do." She met his grey eyes, seeing pain there that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. "I've wondered for 22 years exactly how he died. I need to know." He released her wrist and she continued bandaging his shoulder. "Thomas drew first, took down Jake Garrett with a single shot. Then Billy Garrett got him in the leg, but Thomas kept fighting. Got Billy too before—" He stopped, jaw clenched. "Before what?" "Before Ezra Garrett shot him in the back. Thomas was reloading, and Ezra came up behind him with a rifle." The words hit her like physical blows. She had always imagined Thomas dying in a fair fight, facing his enemies with courage. The reality that he'd been shot down like a dog was somehow worse than not knowing. What happened to the 3rd brother? To Ezra? "I killed him." The words were flat, without emotion. "Put 3 bullets in him before he hit the ground." "Good." The vehemence in her own voice surprised her. "I'm glad." Dallas looked at her with something like surprise. "Most folks would say that makes me no better than him. Most folks never lost someone they loved to a coward's bullet." She finished bandaging his wound and stepped back, suddenly, aware of how close they'd been, how intimate the act of tending his injuries had felt. It had been over 20 years since she'd touched a man with anything approaching gentleness. "Tell me about the letter," she said, settling onto a crate across from him. "He wrote it that morning, like I said. Knew he was riding into trouble, but felt he had to try. Keep the peace if he could." Dallas reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a weathered piece of paper. "This here's a wanted poster. For me." Cora took the poster and held it near the lantern. The face in the crude drawing was younger, harder, but unmistakably Dallas Kane. The reward offered was substantial. $500 for the capture of a dangerous fugitive wanted for murder, robbery, and assault. This was posted 23 years ago, she said, noting the date. Been running from those charges ever since. Some of them are true, some aren't. But the law doesn't much care about the difference. What did you do? Killed a man who needed killing. Problem was, he had friends in high places, friends who twisted the story, made me out to be the villain. He took the poster back, folding it carefully. Been Dallas Kane, the outlaw, ever since. And the men chasing you now, bounty hunters, but not the legal kind. The kind who'll take money from anyone willing to pay for a man's death. Cora absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the wanted criminal with the man who had carried Thomas's letter for over 2 decades. "Why didn't you bring me the letter sooner?" "Tried to, more than once. But every time I got close to Dust Creek, something stopped me. Fear, maybe. Or shame. I couldn't save Thomas, couldn't stop what happened to him. Felt like I had no right to face the woman he loved. So what changed?" Dallas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something. "She couldn't see. Got word that the men hunting me had finally tracked me down. Figured if I was going to die anyway, I might as well keep the promise I made to a good man." The weight of his words settled between them in the cool darkness of the underground chamber. Here was a man who had lived on the run for over 20 years, carrying the guilt of a friend's death and the burden of an unfulfilled promise. And now, in his final hour, he had come to her. "Let me see it," she said quietly. He handed her the letter and she turned it over in her hands, studying Thomas's familiar handwriting. Her name was written in his careful script, the same handwriting that had penned love notes and written proposals for their future together. "Once I open this, there's no going back." "No," Dallas agreed. "There isn't." Above them, they could hear the distant sound of voices and footsteps as their pursuers searched the schoolhouse and surrounding buildings. Time was running short, and decisions needed to be made. Cora looked at the letter one more time, then carefully broke the wax seal. The wax seal cracked under her trembling fingers, releasing the letter from its 22-year prison. Cora unfolded the yellowed paper with the reverence one might show a holy relic, her hands shaking as Thomas's words emerged from the past, like voices from the grave. "My dearest Cora, if you are reading this, then my fears have proven true, and I have not returned from Devil's Canyon as I promised. I pray that whoever brings you this letter is a man of honor, though I suppose any man willing to carry out a dying man's wishes must possess some measure of goodness." Cora's vision blurred with tears, but she blinked them away and continued reading. "By the flickering lantern light, I know you begged me not to ride out today, and I know my decision to go anyway has caused you pain. Please understand that I do not ride toward danger out of recklessness or false pride, but because sometimes a man must stand between the wolves and the flock, even when he knows the cost. I have loved you since the first moment I saw you in your father's store, measuring out flour with such careful precision. I have loved your gentle spirit, your fierce intelligence, and the way you see goodness in everyone you meet. Most of all, I have loved your courage, though I suspect you have never seen yourself as particularly brave." "He's wrong," Cora whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm not brave at all." Dallas said nothing, but she felt his presence in the darkness, steady and comforting in a way that should have frightened her, but somehow didn't. "The ring I gave you was my grandmother's, passed down through 3 generations of Whitmore women who knew love and loss in equal measure. I pray you will wear it not as a symbol of endings, but of the love that continues beyond death. Should you find happiness with another, please know that my spirit rejoices in your joy. Love is not diminished by sharing, it is multiplied." Cora's, and went instinctively to the chain around her neck, where Thomas's ring hung heavy against her heart. For 22 years, she had worn it as a monument to finished things, a barrier against future heartbreak. But he had intended it as something else entirely, a blessing, not a burden. "I have spoken to the Lord about us, and I am at peace with whatever comes. My only regret is the children we will never have, the house we will never build, the 1,000 small moments of married life that will remain forever unrealized. But I would rather have loved you truly for our brief time than loved anyone else for 100 years. Be happy, my darling. Live fully. Do not let my death become a prison for your heart. With all my love, until we meet again. Thomas." The letter fluttered from Cora's nerveless fingers as sobs racked her body. 22 years of careful control crumbled in an instant, releasing a flood of grief she had never allowed herself to feel. She had thought herself strong for building walls around her heart, but Thomas's words revealed the truth. She had been hiding, not healing. Dallas moved closer, his presence a solid anchor in the storm of her emotions. When he spoke, his voice was gentle as falling snow. He was a good man, best I ever knew. I loved him so much, Cora gasped between sobs. And I've wasted so much time, 22 years of half-living, of being afraid. You're not afraid now. She looked up at him through her tears, seeing something in his grey eyes that made her breath catch. Compassion, yes, but something deeper. Understanding born of shared loss and mutual loneliness. You've been carrying this letter all these years, she said, carrying the weight of his death and the burden of an unfulfilled promise. Why? Because keeping promises to good men is about the only thing that separates us from the wolves. The simple honesty of his answer cut through her emotional turmoil like a bell through fog. Here was a man who had lived by a code, who had honored friendship even when it cost him dearly. Tell me about yourself, she said, wiping her eyes with her handkerchief. Your real story, not the wanted poster version. Dallas settled back against the stone wall, his wounded shoulder carefully protected. In the lantern light, his scars told stories of violence and survival, but his eyes held depths of experience that spoke to something in her soul. Grew up on a farm in Kansas, good parents, loving home, was planning to follow in my father's footsteps until the war came. He paused, lost in memory. Joined up when I was 17. Spent 4 years learning that good intentions don't stop. Bullets and honor doesn't always win the day. The war changed you, she said. It wasn't a question. Changed all of us who lived through it. Came home to find my parents dead of fever, the farm sold for taxes. Had nothing left but a horse, a gun, and a set of skills that weren't much good for anything but violence. So you became a bounty hunter. Started out hunting deserters for the army. Then outlaws for the territorial government. Good money, and I told myself I was serving justice. His laugh held no humor. Took me years to realize that justice and law aren't always the same thing. Cora folded Thomas's letter carefully, pressing it against her heart. What happened? The incident that put you on the wrong side of the law. Caught up with a man named Bradley Hutchins, rich rancher's son who'd been buying stolen cattle and selling them back to the army. When I brought him in, his father offered the sheriff more money than I was worth. The story got twisted. Suddenly I was the rustler, and Hutchins was an innocent victim. You could have run then, started over somewhere else. Should have, but I was young and angry, and convinced I could prove my innocence. By the time I realized how deep the corruption went, there were too many people who wanted me dead. He looked at her with those storm-gray eyes. Been running ever since. Until now. The weight of unspoken words hung between them in the underground chamber. Above, they could still hear their pursuers searching, but the sounds were growing more distant as the hunt moved away from the schoolhouse. I need to ask you something, Cora said, her voice barely above a whisper. When you look at me, what do you see? Dallas studied her face in the flickering light, taking in the silver streaks in her auburn hair, the lines around her eyes that spoke of years spent smiling at children, the careful way she held herself, even in this moment of vulnerability. I see a woman who's been living half a life, afraid to let anyone close enough to hurt her, but underneath that fear, I see someone with enough courage to tend a stranger's wounds and enough compassion to read a dead man's letter without hatred. For the messenger. His words stripped away her last defenses. I haven't been touched by a man in 22 years, she confessed. Not a handshake, not a casual brush of fingers. I've been so afraid of feeling anything that I've forgotten how to feel everything. Touch doesn't have to mean pain, doesn't it? Everyone I've ever loved has left me. My parents, Thomas, I'm here. The simple statement hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Dallas reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently touched her cheek. His calloused fingers were warm against her skin, and she felt herself leaning into the contact despite 22 years of self-imposed isolation. "This is foolish," she whispered. "You're a wanted man. By morning you'll be gone, and I'll be alone again, maybe. Or maybe we'll find a way to fight back, against bounty hunters, against corrupt lawmen. I'm a school teacher, Dallas. I don't know anything about fighting. You know about standing up for what's right. You know about protecting the innocent. That's all fighting really is, when you strip away the gun smoke and the glory." Cora closed, her eyes, feeling the warmth of his touch chase away years of cold loneliness. For the first time since Thomas's death, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to be held, to be cherished, to be loved. "Those men who are hunting you," she said, "what do they really want? Me dead, and anyone who might help. Me dead alongside me. Then we can't go back to the schoolhouse, can't go back to my old life. No, we can't." She opened her eyes and met his gaze, seeing her own recognition of the crossroads they'd reached reflected in his expression. Behind them lay safety and solitude. Ahead lay uncertainty and danger, but also the possibility of something she'd thought lost forever. "There's something else," Dallas said quietly. "Something I haven't told you about the day Thomas died." "What?" He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew something that made her breath catch. A silver star, tarnished with age but still bearing the words U.S. Marshal etched into its surface. "I wasn't just a bounty hunter tracking the Garrett gang. I was a federal marshal working undercover to bring them in alive for trial." Cora stared at the badge, its implications sinking in slowly. "You were law enforcement." "Was. Lost my commission when I killed Ezra Garrett. Self-defense or not, the department couldn't overlook the fact that I'd executed a man who was technically my prisoner. So you've been running from the law you once served. Been running from a system that values politics over justice. But that badge represents something more than just authority. It represents the oath I took to protect the innocent and serve the greater good." He held out the badge to her, and she took it with trembling fingers. The metal was cold and heavy, worn smooth by years of handling. "I may not wear this officially anymore, but I've never stopped trying to live by what it represents. And right now, that means keeping you safe and finding a way to clear both our names. How? By exposing the truth about what really happened 22 years ago. By proving that the corruption that destroyed my life is the same corruption that's hunting us now." Cora looked at the badge, then at Thomas's letter, then at the man who had brought them both into her carefully ordered world. 3 symbols of different kinds of service, to law, to love, and to promise-keeping, each representing a choice between safety and courage, between hiding and standing up for what was right. "If we do this," she said slowly, "there's no going back to the way things were. No, there isn't. I could lose everything, my position, my home, my life. Yes. But if we don't fight, they'll kill you anyway." "Yes." Cora stood and walked to the underground stream, splashing cool water on her face and hands. When she turned back to Dallas, her decision was written in the set of her shoulders and the steadiness of her gaze. "Then we fight." Dawn came slowly to the underground chamber, filtered light creeping through hidden crevices in the rock above. Cora had dozed fitfully against Dallas's uninjured shoulder, and she woke to find his grey eyes already open, watching the entrance to their hideout with the alertness of a man accustomed to danger. "They're still out there," he said quietly. "Heard them moving around about an hour ago." Cora sat up, immediately missing the warmth of his presence. Her back ached from sleeping on stone, but it was nothing compared to the ache in her heart. As reality reasserted itself, in the harsh light of morning, their situation seemed even more desperate than it had the night before. "Tell me about the saddlebag," she said, noticing the ornate leather bag that Dallas had brought with him. "The one that contained Thomas's letter." Dallas reached for the bag, running his fingers over the intricate toolwork that decorated its surface. "This belonged to Jake Garrett, the eldest of the 3 brothers. Found it after I killed them. along with some things that didn't make sense at the time. He opened the bag and began removing items: a bundle of letters tied with string, several legal documents, a small leather journal, and a handful of photographs. Each item was carefully preserved, protected from the elements by the bag's quality. Construction. Jake Garrett wasn't just a rustler, Dallas continued. He was keeping records, names, dates, payments. Seems he was working for someone with deeper pockets than cattle theft usually provides. Cora examined the documents by lamplight, her teacher's trained eye picking out details that might escape casual observation. These are land deeds, property transfers, all dated from the months leading up to the Range War. Look at the names on the transfers. She studied the signatures and felt a chill run down her spine. Hutchins, the man whose father had you framed. The same. Turns out the Range War wasn't about water rights or grazing land. It was about forcing small ranchers to sell their property cheap so the big operators could buy up the territory. And Thomas stumbled into the middle of it. Thomas wasn't stumbling. He was investigating. Dallas pulled out the leather journal and opened it to a page filled with Thomas's careful handwriting. Been reading this for 22 years, trying to understand what he was really doing that day. Cora took the journal with trembling hands. Thomas's words stared back at her from the page, written in the same precise script she remembered from their courtship letters. The Garrett brothers are not working alone. Ezra mentioned a big boss who pays them regular wages beyond what they steal. Someone wants the Patterson Ranch specifically. The spring that feeds into Devil's Canyon would give control of water rights for 50 miles in any direction. Jake Garrett has been seen talking with Sheriff Morrison on multiple occasions. Morrison claims they're discussing law enforcement matters, but I've observed money changing hands. If the sheriff is compromised, then legal channels cannot be trusted. I've written to the territorial governor's office requesting a federal investigation, but received no response. Either my letter never arrived, or the corruption reaches higher than I imagined. Tomorrow I ride to Devil's Canyon to confront the Garretts directly. If they are indeed working for someone in town, my appearance may force them to reveal their employer. It's dangerous, but I see no other way to expose the truth. If something happens to me, I pray that justice will eventually prevail, and the innocent people of Dust Creek will be protected from these vultures. Cora's hands shook as she read her fiancé's final thoughts. He knew it was a trap. He rode out there deliberately, hoping to expose the conspiracy, and it got him killed, but not before he gathered enough evidence to bring down the whole operation. Evidence that died with him. Not all of it. Dallas reached deeper into the saddlebag and withdrew something that made Cora gasp. A thick envelope, sealed and addressed to the territorial governor in Thomas's handwriting. He mailed the evidence. Never got the chance. This was in his saddlebag when he rode out. The Garretts took everything after they killed him. Probably didn't even know what they had. Cora held the envelope, feeling the weight of papers inside. 22 years of secrets, 22 years of wondering why Thomas had to die, and 22 years of the guilty parties thinking they got away with murder. Hutchins, his father, most likely. Bradley was always more interested in drinking and gambling than business. But Samuel Hutchins, he's the kind of man who'd orchestrate a range war to increase his holdings. Is he still alive? Very much so. Owns half the territory now, sits on the territorial council, respected pillar of the community. Dallas's voice carried bitter irony. Amazing how easy it is to build a reputation when you've eliminated all the witnesses to your crimes. Cora studied the documents spread before them, her teacher's mind organizing the information into patterns and connections. If we can prove this conspiracy, it would clear your name and give Thomas the justice he deserves. But who would believe us if the corruption reaches as high as the territorial government? There's a new federal judge in Helena, Marcus Thornfield. He's got a reputation for honesty and isn't beholden to the local power structure. Helena is 3 days' ride from here, through country controlled by the same people who want you dead. I know. Dallas began carefully repacking the documents. which is why I need to ask something of you. What? Come with me. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge thrown down by fate itself. Cora felt her carefully reconstructed world shift on its axis once again. I can't. My students, my responsibilities, will mean nothing if Hutchins decides you know too much, and after yesterday he'll assume I've told you everything. But I'm not a fighter. I don't know how to survive in the wilderness, how to evade pursuit. You know how to think, how to plan, how to keep your head in a crisis. Dallas met her eyes. And you're the only person alive who knew Thomas well enough to testify about his character and his investigations. They'll come after us. They're already coming after us. At least this way, we'll be moving towards something instead of just running. Cora closed her eyes, feeling the weight of decision pressing down on her like a physical force. Everything rational told her to refuse, to find some way to return to her safe, orderly life. But Thomas's letter burned in her pocket, and his ring hung heavy around her neck, and she could hear his voice as clearly as if he were standing beside her. Be happy, my darling. Live fully. Do not let my death become a prison for your heart. If we do this, she said slowly, we'll need supplies, food, ammunition, medical supplies. Doc Henley might help. He was Thomas's friend too. No, Doc Henley drinks too much and talks even more. By evening, half the territory would know we'd been to see him. Then who? Cora thought for a moment, running through the list of people in Dust Creek who might be trusted with their lives. The list was discouragingly short. Mrs. Patterson, she owns the general store, and she's been suspicious of Sheriff Morrison's new prosperity ever since he bought that fancy house last year. Can you get to her without being seen? Maybe. The tunnel system under the town is more extensive than most people know. The old mine connected to several buildings before it played out. Then that's our plan. Get supplies from Mrs. Patterson, then head for Helena under cover of darkness. And if we're caught, Dallas checked his revolver, spinning the cylinder to ensure it was loaded, then we go down fighting. The grimness of his words drove home the reality of their situation. They were about to stake their lives on a gamble. That justice could prevail over corruption, that truth could triumph over power and money. There's one more thing, Cora said, reaching into her pocket. Something I should have done 22 years ago. She pulled out Thomas's ring, the gold band that had hung around her neck like a chain binding her to the past. For a moment she held it in her palm, feeling its familiar weight. Then, with deliberate care, she slipped it onto the ring finger of her right hand. Not as a monument to finish things, she said, echoing his letter, but as a reminder that love continues beyond death. Dallas nodded, understanding the significance of the gesture. He'd be proud of you. I hope so. She stood and shouldered her small pack. Because I'm about to do something that would have terrified the woman I was yesterday. What's that? Trust a wanted man with my life, and bet everything on the hope that justice still means something in this territory. That's not terrifying, Dallas said with a slight smile. That's brave. The tunnel that led to Patterson's general store was narrower than the mine shaft, forcing them to move in single file through the cramped space. Cora led the way, her lantern casting dancing shadows on the earthen walls as they navigated the underground passage that few people knew existed. The tunnel had been dug during the early mining days, connecting the store's basement to the main mine complex to facilitate the movement of supplies. Mrs. Patterson used to hide Confederate gold. Down here during the war, Cora whispered as they reached a wooden door set into the tunnel wall. Her husband was a Southern sympathizer, though she never spoke of it openly. Will she help us? If I explain the situation properly, yes. She's never forgotten that Thomas used to fix her roof every spring without charge, and she's never trusted Sheriff Morrison's sudden wealth. The door opened into the basement of the general store, where shelves of preserved goods and dry supplies created narrow aisles in the underground storage area. Cora extinguished the lantern and listened carefully, hearing only the familiar creak of floorboards above as Mrs. Patterson went about her morning routine. "Wait here," she instructed Dallas. "Let me talk to her first." Cora climbed the narrow stairs that led to the store's main floor, emerging behind the counter where bolts of fabric and household goods were displayed. Eleanor Patterson stood at the front window, a woman of 65 with steel-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. She turned at the sound of footsteps, her face showing surprise and immediate concern. "Cora? Child, what are you doing here so early? And why do you look like you've been sleeping in a mine shaft?" "Mrs. Patterson, I need your help, and I need your word that you'll tell no one what I'm about to share with you." The older woman's expression grew serious. She walked to the front door, turned the sign to closed, and drew the curtains across the windows. "Sit down, dear, tell me everything." Cora had always respected Eleanor Patterson's no-nonsense approach to life and her fierce loyalty to the people she cared about. Now she found herself explaining the events of the past 24 hours, from Dallas's dramatic entrance to the discovery of Thomas's letter and the evidence of corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Mrs. Patterson listened without interruption, her weathered hands folded in her lap and her sharp eyes never leaving Cora's face. When the story was finished, she sat in silence for a long moment, processing the implications. "I knew there was something wrong about the way Thomas died," she said finally. "Boy was too careful, too smart to ride into an ambush unless he had a reason, and I've never understood how Sheriff Morrison could afford that new house on a lawman's salary. Will you help us?" "Help you do what exactly?" "Get supplies for a journey to Helena. Food, ammunition, medical supplies. Enough to last us 4 days in rough country." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose. "You're planning to ride to Helena? Cora, dear, you haven't been on a horse in 20 years, and you've never spent a night outdoors in your life." "I know, but there's a federal judge there who might listen to our evidence. It's our only chance to clear Dallas's name and bring Thomas's killers to justice. And if you're caught, then at least we'll have tried to do the right thing instead of hiding in the shadows." Mrs. Patterson smiled for the first time since Cora had begun her story. "Thomas would be proud of you. You've got his sense of justice and his stubborn determination to see it done. Does that mean you'll help?" "Child, I'll do more than help. I'll outfit you for the journey and throw in some extra supplies for good measure." She stood and began, moving around the store, gathering items from various shelves. "But first, I want to meet this Dallas Kane. Any man who carried Thomas's letter for 22 years is someone I need to look in the eye." Cora led Mrs. Patterson down to the basement, where Dallas waited in the shadows among the stored goods. When the lantern light revealed his face, the older woman studied him with the same intensity she brought to evaluating the quality of merchandise. "You're bigger than I expected," she said finally. "And those are honest eyes, despite what the wanted posters might say." "Ma'am," Dallas said, touching the brim of his hat, "I'm grateful for any help you're willing to provide." "Don't be grateful yet. I haven't decided whether you're worthy of this young woman's trust." She circled him slowly, taking in his wounded shoulder, his weathered appearance, the careful way he carried himself. "Thomas Whitmore was the finest man I ever knew, aside from my late husband. If you've been carrying his letter all these years, it means he saw something in you worth believing in." "I hope so, ma'am. Show me the evidence you've gathered." Dallas spread the documents on a wooden crate, explaining the significance of each piece of evidence, while Mrs. Patterson examined them with the sharp eye of someone accustomed to evaluating the truth of men's claims. "This is damning," she said. When he finished, "Samuel Hutchins has been buying up land all over the territory, always seeming to know which properties would become available before their owners knew they wanted to sell. You've noticed the pattern. Hard not to, when you're one of the few independent business owners left. He's made offers for this store 3 times in the past 5 years, each time after some misfortune befell a neighboring business." "What kind of misfortune?" Cora asked. "Fire at the blacksmith shop, suspicious timing, since it happened the night after Jake Henderson refused to sell. Mysterious illness that killed most of Martin Crowley's cattle, forcing him to sell his ranch at a loss. The bank suddenly calling in loans that had been current for years." Mrs. Patterson's voice grew hard. Always coincidences, but too many. Coincidences to be believable. He's been doing this for over 20 years, Dallas said, using violence and intimidation to build his empire. And getting away with it because he owns the sheriff and probably half the territorial government. Mrs. Patterson began gathering supplies from the shelves around them. All the more reason to get this evidence to someone who can act on it. She worked efficiently, assembling a collection of supplies that would sustain them on the journey to Helena, dried meat and hardtack for sustenance, ammunition for Dallas's revolver, medical supplies for treating wounds, and even a change of clothes for Cora that would be more suitable for travel than her teacher's dress. "There's something else you'll need," Mrs. Patterson said, disappearing deeper into the basement and returning with a rifle wrapped in oilcloth. "This belonged to my husband. He'd want it used in service of justice." Cora stared at the weapon, her hands shaking as she realized what Mrs. Patterson was suggesting. "I don't know how to use a rifle." "Then you'd better learn quick," the older woman said bluntly. "The men hunting you won't hesitate to kill a woman if she's standing between them and their target." Dallas took the rifle and checked its action, nodding approval at its condition. "It's a good weapon, accurate and reliable." "Can you teach me?" Cora asked him. "Yes, but learning to shoot and learning to kill are different things. Are you prepared for that possibility?" Cora thought about Thomas's letter, about 22 years of injustice, about the children in her classroom who deserved to grow up in a world where truth mattered more than money. She thought about her teaching certificate hanging on the schoolhouse wall, representing her dedication to nurturing others while denying herself the chance to fight for what was right. If it means stopping the people who killed Thomas and corrupted our entire territory, then yes, I'm prepared. Mrs. Patterson smiled grimly. "Good, because they won't give you the luxury of moral uncertainty when the shooting starts." As they finished gathering supplies, the sound of horses approaching the store made them all freeze. Through the basement window, they could see the shadows of mounted men surrounding the building. "Sheriff Morrison," Mrs. Patterson said quietly, recognizing the voice calling her name from outside. "He's brought friends." "How many?" Dallas asked, checking his revolver. "4, maybe 5. Too many to fight here without putting Mrs. Patterson in danger." "There's another way out," the older woman said, leading them to a second door hidden behind stacks of flour sacks. "This tunnel leads to the old church basement. From there you can reach the livery stable without being seen." "What about you?" Cora asked. "I'll handle the sheriff. Tell him I've been down here doing inventory all morning and haven't seen hide nor hair of any fugitives." Mrs. Patterson's eyes glinted with mischief. "Wouldn't be the first time I've lied to the law about what's hidden in my basement." Dallas shouldered his pack and the rifle, while Cora gathered the smaller supplies. At the tunnel entrance, she turned back to Mrs. Patterson. "Thank you for everything. Don't thank me yet, child. Just survive long enough to see justice done. That'll be thanks enough." As they disappeared into the tunnel, they could hear Sheriff Morrison pounding on the store's front door, demanding entry. Behind them, Mrs. Patterson climbed the stairs to face whatever questions and threats awaited her. "She's taking a terrible risk," Cora whispered as they moved through the narrow passage. "Good people always do," Dallas replied. "That's what makes them good." The tunnel to the old church was the longest yet, requiring them to crawl through sections where the ceiling dropped too low for walking. Cora's dress caught on rough timber supports, and her hands were scraped raw by the time they emerged in. The basement of the abandoned chapel. Dust Creek's church had been destroyed in a fire 5 years earlier, and the congregation had never found the funds to rebuild. Now only the stone foundation remained, overgrown with weeds and haunted by memories of better days. Dallas helped her climb out of the tunnel, his strong hands steadying her as she brushed dirt from her clothes. In the dim light filtering through the ruined building above, she could see the strain of their escape written in the lines around his eyes. "Your shoulder," she said, noticing fresh blood seeping through the bandage. "The crawling has reopened the wound. It'll hold until we reach the stable. Can you make it that far? Before she could answer, the sound of voices above made them both freeze. Heavy boots walked across the charred floorboards of the church, and through the gaps in the burned timbers they could see the silhouettes of armed men searching the ruins. "Check every hiding place," a familiar voice commanded. "Sheriff Morrison. They've got to be somewhere in town. Maybe they kept riding," another voice suggested. "Could be halfway to the mountains by now." No, Kane's wounded, and the schoolmarm wouldn't last an hour in rough country. They're holed up somewhere, waiting for dark to make their move. Dallas drew his revolver and motioned for Cora to stay low. Above them, the searchers moved methodically through the ruins, poking at debris and checking every potential hiding spot. One of them walked directly over the concealed entrance to the basement, his boots inches from their heads. "Sheriff," a third voice called from outside, "found something at the schoolhouse." Morrison's footsteps moved away from their hiding spot. As he went to investigate the discovery, in the momentary quiet that followed, Dallas helped Cora gather their scattered supplies. "What do you think they found?" she whispered. "Blood, most likely. Maybe some torn fabric from my shirt." He secured the saddlebag containing the evidence, making sure it was protected from damage. "Doesn't matter. We need to reach those horses and get out of town before they expand their search." They waited until the voices moved away from the church, then carefully climbed the stone steps that led to ground level. The church ruins provided some concealment, but crossing the open ground to the livery stable would leave them exposed for several crucial seconds. "There!" Dallas pointed to a route that would take them behind the remains of the church bell tower and along a drainage ditch that ran toward the stable. "Stay low and move fast." They had just reached the cover of the drainage ditch when Cora heard something that made her heart stop. Her own voice calling out across the town square, "Please don't hurt him. He's wounded." She grabbed Dallas's arm in confusion. "That's impossible. I never—" "Quiet," he whispered urgently, pulling her deeper into the ditch. The voice came again, pleading and desperate. "Sheriff Morrison, please. He forced me to help him. I was frightened." Understanding hit Cora like a physical blow. Someone was impersonating her voice, creating a false narrative to explain her absence from the schoolhouse. But who would know her well enough to mimic her speech patterns, and why would they want to protect her reputation while condemning Dallas? The answer came as they reached the edge of the livery stable and could see into the town square. A woman stood beside Sheriff Morrison, her auburn hair streaked with silver, wearing a dress identical to the one Cora had worn the day before. From a distance, the resemblance was striking. "My sister," Cora breathed. "Margaret." Dallas looked between Cora and the woman in the square, seeing the family resemblance that would make the deception believable to anyone who didn't know both sisters well. "Where has she been?" "San Francisco. Moved there after her husband died. Said she couldn't bear to stay in Dust Creek with all the memories." Cora watched in amazement as Margaret played her role perfectly, sobbing convincingly as she described being held captive by the dangerous fugitive. "I haven't seen her in 3 years. She's covering for you, giving you time to escape. But why? She never approved of my decision to remain unmarried, always said I was wasting my life mourning a dead man." The answer became clear as they listened to Margaret's performance. She wasn't just protecting her sister. She was creating a story that would preserve Cora's reputation and standing in the community. According to Margaret's account, Cora had been an innocent victim, forced to help the outlaw under threat of violence. When the opportunity arose, she had bravely escaped and reported the incident to the authorities. "Your sister understands more than you realized," Dallas said quietly. "She's giving you the chance to seek justice while protecting your ability to return home if things go wrong." But as they watched the scene unfold, Cora noticed something that chilled her blood. Margaret wasn't just telling a story, she was handing over something to Sheriff Morrison, something small and rectangular that looked suspiciously like an envelope. "No," Cora whispered, her hand flying to her pocket where Thomas's letter should have been. The pocket was empty. In the chaos of their underground escape, the letter must have fallen out. And somehow Margaret had found it and was now giving it to the very people they were trying to evade. Dallas saw her realization and immediately understood the implications. The letter. She doesn't know what she's doing. She doesn't understand that Morrison is corrupt. Or she does know, and she's trying to protect you by removing the evidence that connects you to my cause. The possibility hit Cora like a sledgehammer. Margaret might believe she was saving her sister by destroying the very evidence that could clear Dallas's name and expose the conspiracy that had killed Thomas. We have to stop her. It's too late. Morrison has the letter now. They watched in horror as the sheriff examined the envelope, his face showing recognition and something that looked like fear. He spoke quietly to Margaret, who nodded and pointed toward the schoolhouse. Then he folded the letter carefully and placed it in his vest pocket. "He's not going to destroy it," Dallas observed. "He's keeping it. Why? Because Thomas's letter is evidence of the conspiracy, but it's also evidence that could be used against his enemies if necessary. Men like Morrison always keep insurance, policies. Then we still have a chance to recover it. Maybe. But now we're not just fighting to clear my name and expose the truth. We're fighting to save your sister from the consequences of helping us." As if summoned by their words, Margaret turned and looked directly toward their hiding place. For a moment, Cora thought her sister had seen them, but Margaret's gaze moved on, searching the buildings and shadows around the square. Then Sheriff Morrison gave an order that made their situation infinitely more dangerous. "Postmen at every road out of town. Nobody leaves Dust Creek without being searched. And put a guard on this woman. If her sister tries to contact her, I want to know about it immediately." "You think the school mom will come back?" one of the deputies asked. "I think she's more involved in this than she's letting on. And I think her outlaw friend won't abandon her to face the consequences alone." The trap was closing around them with methodical precision. Morrison wasn't just hunting them, he was using Margaret as bait, counting on the family bond to draw them into his web. "We need those horses," Dallas said grimly, "and we need them now, before he posts guards at the stable." They crept toward the livery, using the shadows of buildings and abandoned equipment for cover. The stable sat at the edge of town, where the main street faded into prairie grass and open country. If they could reach it undetected, they might still have a chance to escape before the net closed completely. But as they approached the building, Cora realized their problems had multiplied beyond simple pursuit. Through the stable's open doors, she could see 2 horses saddled and ready, but also 2 men standing guard, rifles in hand, and eyes scanning the approaches. "Trap," Dallas murmured. Morrison anticipated this move. The pocket watch in Dallas's vest had belonged to his father, a man who believed that time healed all wounds and that patience could overcome any obstacle. The inscription on its silver case read, "Time heals all wounds," words that had sustained Dallas through 22 years of running and regret. Now, as he checked the time by lamplight in the abandoned mine shaft behind the livery stable, he wondered if his father had been wrong about healing and right about timing, because their window of opportunity was closing fast. 15 minutes past noon, he said quietly. Morrison will have posted guards at every exit by now. Cora knelt beside the underground stream that flowed through the cave system, washing the dirt from her hands and face. The cold water shocked her system, but it also cleared her mind and sharpened her focus. She had spent 22 years as a careful, controlled woman who avoided risk and confrontation. Now she was about to attempt something that would have been unthinkable to the person she'd been yesterday morning. "Tell me about the layout of the sheriff's office," Dallas said, spreading the documents from Jake Garrett's saddlebag on a flat rock. "If Morrison is keeping Thomas's letter as insurance, he'll want it somewhere secure, but accessible. There's a safe behind his desk. Combination lock, installed about 5 years ago when he started handling federal tax collections." Cora joined him beside the documents, her teacher's mind automatically organizing the information into useful categories. "But Dallas, We're not just planning a robbery. We're planning to rescue Margaret and expose 22 years of corruption. That's going to require more than stealth and luck. What are you thinking? I'm thinking we need allies. People who have been hurt by Hutchins and Morrison. People who would stand with us if they knew the truth. Dallas studied the land deeds and financial records spread before them. According to these documents, Hutchins has forced at least a dozen families off their land over the past 2 decades. Some of those people are still in the territory. The Henderson family, the Crowleys, the Bishops, all good people who lost everything to suspicious circumstances. Cora traced the property lines on a hand-drawn map included in the papers. If we could prove that their misfortunes weren't accidents, we'd have an army of angry citizens ready to demand justice. But first we need to get this evidence to them, and we need to make sure Margaret is safe. 2 separate problems requiring 2 separate solutions. Dallas began repacking the documents carefully. What if we split up? No. The word came out sharper than Cora intended. I won't lose anyone else to this conspiracy. We go together, or we don't go at all. Dallas looked at her with something approaching admiration. You're not the same woman who ordered me out of her schoolhouse yesterday. Yesterday I thought safety meant hiding from the world. Today I understand that real safety comes from fighting for the world you want to live in. They made their way through the cave system, following the underground stream toward its outlet. North of town, the caves were larger than Cora had remembered from childhood explorations, with chambers that could easily hide a dozen people and passages that connected to other parts of Dust Creek's underground network. This place could serve as a base of operations, she said, as they passed through a particularly large cavern. If we could gather the displaced families here, we could plan our approach without fear of being overheard. How do we contact them without alerting Morrison's network? The same way news has always traveled in small communities, through the women. Mrs. Patterson isn't the only person in Dust Creek who distrusts the sheriff's sudden prosperity. There are others who've wondered about the convenient timing of various disasters. They emerged from the caves near the old Henderson property, where a burned-out farmhouse stood as a monument to one family's destroyed dreams. The fire had happened 3 years ago, during a particularly dry summer when wildfires were common. But according to the documents in Jake Garrett's saddlebag, the fire had occurred exactly 1 week after Martin Henderson refused to sell his land to Hutchins. Someone needs to see this, Cora said, examining the blackened timbers that had once been a family's home. Someone who remembers what really happened. The Hendersons moved to Denver after the fire, Dallas said, but their eldest son Tom works at the Peterson Ranch. He might be willing to listen, more than willing. Tom Henderson was one of my students, a good boy who loved his family's farm and never understood why his father gave up so easily after the fire. They made their way across the countryside, staying away from main roads and using the natural cover of rolling hills and creek beds to avoid detection. Cora's body ached from the unaccustomed exertion, but her mind felt clearer than it had in years. For the first time since Thomas's death, she was moving towards something instead of away from it. The Peterson Ranch sat in a valley protected by low hills, its buildings showing the prosperity that came from honest work and careful management. Tom Henderson was mending fences in the north pasture when they found him, his movements carrying the economical grace of a man who understood the value of every motion. Miss Elwood? He straightened in surprise, his weathered face showing the confusion of seeing his former teacher in trail-worn clothes, accompanied by a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a wanted poster. What are you doing way out here? Tom, I need you to look at something about your family's farm. She showed him the documents, explaining their significance, while Dallas kept watch for any sign of pursuit. Tom's expression grew darker. With each revelation, his hands clenching into fists as the pattern of manipulation and destruction became clear. I knew it, he said when she finished. Pa always said the fire wasn't natural, said it burned too hot and spread too fast, but the sheriff said there was no evidence of arson and the insurance company wouldn't pay without an official investigation. Your Father was right to be suspicious. This conspiracy has been destroying families for over 20 years, always making it look like accidents or bad luck. What can we do about it? Hutchins owns half the territory, and Morrison controls the law. We can expose the truth, but we need help from people who have suffered under their corruption. Tom was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the documents that proved his family's innocence and their enemies' guilt. When he looked up, his eyes held the same determination Cora remembered from his school days. The Crowley brothers are working the Johnson spread about 10 miles south. The bishops are sharecropping for the Willis family. If I could get word to them, tell them what you've found. How long would that take? 2 hours if I ride hard. 3 hours to gather them all at a central meeting point. Where? The old church. It's been abandoned since the fire, but the foundation is solid, and there's good cover from the surrounding hills. Cora looked at Dallas, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his expression. They were about to trust their lives and their evidence to people they hadn't seen in years, people who had every reason to be bitter and angry about their treatment at the hands of the law. "There's something else," she said to Tom. "My sister, Margaret, is being held by Sheriff Morrison. She's in danger because she tried to help us, and we need to get her out before we can move against the conspiracy." "How many men does Morrison have?" "At least 6 deputies, plus however many hired guns Hutchins brought in for the manhunt." Tom considered this information, his mind working through the tactical challenges of their situation. The Crowley brothers were cavalry during the war. The bishops know this country better than anyone. If we can prove to them that justice is possible, they'll fight. And if we can't prove it, then we'll all hang together instead of separately. The grim humor of his words broke some of the tension, and Cora found herself smiling for the first time in days. This was the Tom Henderson she remembered, practical, loyal, and completely unafraid of necessary risks. "Go," she said. "Gather whoever you can trust. Tell them to meet us at the church foundation at sunset. And Tom, tell them to come armed." After Tom rode away on his borrowed horse, Dallas and Cora made their way back toward Dust Creek through the network of canyons and dry washes that provided concealment from casual observation. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, and shadows were growing longer among the rocks and scrub brush. "Are you ready for this?" Dallas asked, as they took shelter in a grove of cottonwoods within sight of the town. "Once we start this fight, there's no backing down." "I've been ready for 22 years, Cora replied. "I just didn't know it." She pulled Thomas's ring from the chain around her neck and slipped it onto her finger, feeling the weight of promises. Kept and promises yet to be fulfilled. The gold band caught the afternoon light, throwing tiny rainbows across the back of her hand. "He would be proud of you," Dallas said quietly. "I hope so, because I'm about to honor his memory in a way he never could have imagined." They spent the remaining hours of daylight planning their approach to the sheriff's office, studying the building's layout, and identifying the best routes for both infiltration and escape. As the sun touched the western hills and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they heard the sound of horses approaching the old church foundation. Tom Henderson had kept his promise. Through the gathering dusk, they could see the silhouettes of men and women gathering among the ruins, their faces grim with purpose and their hands resting on the weapons they carried. Time to find out if justice still means something in this. "Territory," Dallas said, checking his father's pocket watch one final time. "Time to finish what Thomas started," Cora agreed. Together, they walked toward the church ruins and the confrontation that would determine the future of Dust Creek, and everyone who called it home. The school bell had been cast from the melted-down weapons of fallen soldiers after the range war ended, a symbol of Dust Creek's commitment to peace and education over violence. Now, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of blood and gold, that same bell would ring again, not to call children to their lessons, but to signal the beginning of a reckoning 22 years in the making. 12 people had gathered among the ruins of the old church. their faces showing the weathered determination of men and women who had lost everything to corruption and were finally ready to fight back. The Crowley brothers, lean and hard-eyed from their cavalry days, checked their rifles with the practiced efficiency of soldiers. The Bishop family, father, mother, and 2 grown sons, spoke in quiet voices about the night their cattle had mysteriously sickened and died. Other faces bore the same story of loss and injustice, of dreams destroyed by the greed of powerful. Mendakora stood before them in the gathering darkness, her teacher's voice carrying clearly across the ruined foundation as she explained what they had discovered. She held up the documents from Jake Garrett's saddlebag, the evidence that proved their suspicions about Sheriff Morrison and Samuel Hutchins. "Every one of you has suffered because of these men," she said, her words cutting through the evening air like a blade. "Every fire, every illness, every convenient accident that forced you from your land, it was all orchestrated by the same conspiracy that killed Thomas Whitmore and destroyed countless other lives. What proof do we have that won't just get us all hanged as vigilantes?" asked Martha Bishop, her weathered hands steady on the shotgun she carried. Dallas stepped forward, his marshal's badge catching the last rays of sunlight. "This is my authority. Federal jurisdiction supersedes local corruption. What we're planning isn't vigilante justice, it's law enforcement." "You've been a wanted man for 22 years, Tom Henderson pointed out. "How do we know this badge means anything? Because the charges against me were fabricated by the same people who've been destroying your lives. The evidence we've gathered proves that Samuel Hutchins orchestrated not only the Range War, but every major land grab in this territory since then." "And how do we get that evidence to someone who can act on it?" asked James Crowley, the elder of the 2 brothers. "First, we rescue Margaret Elwood from the sheriff's office," Cora said firmly. "She's being held as bait, and she's in danger because she tried to protect me. Then we secure the evidence Morrison is keeping in his safe, including Thomas's original letter, which provides context for everything else we've discovered." "That's a lot of objectives for one night's work," observed Samuel Bishop, the family patriarch. "Morrison's got at least 6 armed deputies, plus whoever Hutchins brought in from outside. Which is why we're not going in like common outlaws," Dallas said. "We're going in as citizens demanding justice under federal authority." The plan they outlined was ambitious, but built on the strengths of their small force. The Crowley brothers would position themselves on the rooftops overlooking the sheriff's office, providing covering fire and preventing escape routes from being used. The Bishop family would secure the approaches to the building, ensuring that no reinforcements could arrive undetected. Tom Henderson and 2 other men would guard the horses and maintain a clear escape route. "What about the townspeople?" asked Martha Bishop. "Some of them might support Morrison, but others might join us if they understood what was really happening." "That's where the bell comes in," Cora said, looking toward the schoolhouse where the bronze bell waited in its tower. "When we ring it 3 times, everyone in Dust Creek will know that something significant is happening. Those who support justice will come to help. Those who support corruption will show their true colors. And if more people stand with Morrison than with us, then we'll know we fought for what was right, regardless of the outcome." As full darkness settled over the valley, the group made their final preparations. Weapons were checked, positions were assigned, and last messages were quietly shared among family members. Everyone understood that some of them might not see another sunrise, but the alternative, continuing to live under the boot of corruption, was no longer acceptable. Dallas and Cora would approach the sheriff's office directly, using the authority of his federal badge to demand entry. If Morrison refused to cooperate, the others would move into position for a coordinated assault. If he opened the door, they would attempt to resolve the situation through legal means. "Remember," Dallas said as they prepared to move out, "we're not here to start a war. We're here to end one that's been going on for over 20 years. They moved through the darkened streets of Dust Creek like shadows given purpose, each person carrying the weight of old grievances and new hope. The town seemed to hold its breath as they approached the sheriff's office, its windows glowing with lamplight in the darkness. From their position across the street, they could see movement inside the building. Sheriff Morrison sat at his desk, apparently going through paperwork. Two deputies played cards at a smaller table near the front door. Through a barred window, they caught a glimpse of Margaret in one of the holding cells, alive but clearly frightened. "3 guards that we can see," Dallas whispered. "Probably more in the back rooms. Are you ready?" Cora touched Thomas's ring on her finger, feeling the weight of all the promises that had brought them to this moment. Then she reached for the brass bell that Tom Henderson had retrieved from the schoolhouse, its bronze surface cold and heavy in her hands. "I'm ready." The first bell toll echoed across Dust Creek like thunder, announcing that the long night of reckoning had begun. The second bell toll was still echoing across Dust Creek when Thomas's rifle spoke for the first time in 22 years. Cora had retrieved the weapon from the schoolhouse during their approach, and now it felt solid and purposeful in her hands. As she aimed through the sheriff's office window, she wasn't shooting to kill, not yet, but the bullet that shattered the lamp on Morrison's desk sent a clear message that the time for negotiation was rapidly ending. "Sheriff Morrison!" Dallas's voice carried the authority of federal law as he stepped into the circle of light cast by the office's front windows. "This is U.S. Marshal Dallas Kane. I'm ordering you to release your prisoner and surrender yourself for questioning in connection with federal crimes." The response came in the form of gunfire from the office windows, muzzle flashes strobing in. The darkness as Morrison's deputies opened fire on the street. Dallas dove for cover behind a water trough, splinters flying from the wooden structure as bullets struck all around him. From her position behind the blacksmith's forge, Cora worked the lever on Thomas's rifle and sent another shot through the office window. This one found its mark, and one of the card-playing deputies cried out and stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder. "This is your last warning," Dallas shouted. "Release Margaret Elwood and surrender peacefully." The third bell toll rang out across the town, and its summons was answered. Doors began opening along the main street as citizens emerged to see what was happening. Some carried lanterns, others carried weapons, and their faces showed the mixture of fear and curiosity that came with witnessing history in the making. Eleanor Patterson appeared in the doorway of her general store, a shotgun cradled in her arms and her grey hair shining in the lamplight. Behind her came Doc Henley, swaying slightly but carrying his medical bag and a determined expression. "What's going on out here?" Patterson called. "Justice, finally," Tom Henderson answered from his position near the stable. 22 years. Overdue, but better late than never. The sight of respected townspeople taking sides seemed to galvanize others. The pastor's wife emerged from the parsonage with her husband's hunting rifle. The bank clerk appeared with a pistol and a ledger book that probably contained records of Morrison's suspicious deposits. Even young Billy Morrison, the sheriff's own son, stepped out of his family's house with confusion and growing understanding written across his teenage face. But not everyone who answered the bell's call came to support justice. Samuel Hutchins rode up with 6 armed men, their faces hard and their intentions clear. Behind them came 3 more riders, federal marshals by their badges, but their allegiance was questionable given their association with Hutchins. "This ends now," Hutchins shouted, his voice carrying across the street. "Kane is a wanted fugitive, and anyone helping him is committing a federal crime. The only crime here is 22 years of corruption." Cora called back, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "We have the evidence, Hutchins. We know about the range war, about the land grabs, about every family you've destroyed. You have nothing but the fantasies of a bitter old woman and a desperate outlaw." The accusation stung, but it also strengthened Cora's resolve. She was no longer the frightened schoolteacher who had hidden from life behind her classroom walls. She was a woman with a purpose, fighting for the memory of the man she'd loved and the future of the community she'd served. Tell that to the "Hendersons," she shouted back. "Tell that to the Crowleys and the Bishops and every other family whose lives you've destroyed." As if summoned by her words, the displaced families stepped out of the shadows where they'd been positioning themselves. Their rifles glinted in the lamplight as they formed a line across the street, facing Hutchins and his hired guns. "This is your last chance, Samuel," Dallas called out, his marshal's badge visible on his chest. "Surrender peacefully and you'll get a fair trial. Keep fighting, and we'll end this the hard way." Hutchins's response was to draw his own weapon and fire at Dallas's position. The shot went wide, but it was enough to shatter the fragile peace that had held the two sides apart. The battle for Dust Creek erupted in a storm of gunfire and shouting voices. From the rooftops, the Crowley brothers laid down covering fire that kept Hutchins's men pinned behind their horses. The Bishop family advanced steadily along the boardwalk, their coordinated movement speaking to years of working together in dangerous country. Inside the sheriff's office, Morrison and his remaining deputies were trapped between the crossfire outside and the growing realization that their position was becoming untenable. Through the broken windows, Cora could see Margaret pressed against the wall of her cell, terrified but unharmed. "The safe!" Dallas shouted over the gunfire. "We need to get to that safe!" Cora nodded and began working her way around the building, using the cover of smoke and darkness to approach the rear entrance. Thomas's rifle felt natural in her hands now, an extension of her will and her determination to see justice done. Behind her, the sound of breaking glass announced that someone else was also attempting to breach the sheriff's office. The final confrontation was about to begin, and 22 years of secrets were about to be exposed in the light of gunfire and truth. 6 months later, Cora stood at the altar of the rebuilt Dust Creek Church, her hands trembling slightly as she held the simple gold band that the town blacksmith had crafted with his own hands. The ring was nothing like the elaborate jewelry that wealthy women wore in the territorial capital, but it represented something far more precious: hope, new beginnings, and the courage to love again despite past losses. Dallas stood beside her, his marshal's badge gleaming on his vest, and his grey eyes warm with an emotion that had nothing to do with duty or justice. The scars on his hands and face told stories of violence and survival, but the gentle way he touched her fingers spoke of a man who had finally found peace. "Do you, Cora Elwood, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" Pastor Williams's voice carried clearly through the small church, reaching every corner of the building that had been reconstructed through the combined efforts of a community determined to rebuild what corruption had tried to destroy. The congregation included faces both familiar and new: former students who had returned to witness their teacher's wedding, displaced families who had reclaimed their stolen land, and federal officials who had come to ensure that justice truly prevailed in Dust Creek. "I do," Cora said, her voice steady despite the tears that tracked down her cheeks. As Dallas slipped the ring onto her finger beside Thomas's engagement ring, she felt the weight of 22 years of sorrow lifting from her shoulders. She had not forgotten her first love, would never forget him, but she had finally learned the difference between honoring the past and being imprisoned by it. The trial of Samuel Hutchins and Sheriff Morrison had lasted 3 weeks and had drawn attention from newspapers across the territory. The evidence Dallas and Cora had gathered, combined with testimony from the families who had suffered under the conspiracy, had painted a picture of corruption so extensive that it had shocked even experienced federal prosecutors. Hutchins had been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, his vast holdings confiscated and redistributed to the families he had cheated. Morrison had received 15 years, his badge stripped and his name forever associated with the betrayal of public trust. The hired guns who had survived the battle in Dust Creek's main street had either fled the territory or found themselves facing charges of their own. But perhaps the most satisfying moment of the entire proceedings had come when Judge Marcus Thornfield had officially restored Dallas's federal commission, clearing his name and acknowledging the courage he had shown in carrying out his duty despite 22 years of persecution. By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana and the federal government of the United States, I now pronounce you husband and wife, Pastor Williams announced. Marshal Kane, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was gentle and sweet, tasting of promises kept and futures embraced. When they separated, Dallas touched his forehead to hers and whispered words that only she could hear. Thomas would approve. Yes, she whispered back. He would. The reception was held in the restored schoolhouse, its walls now bearing photographs of the students who had attended classes there over the years and the teachers who had served the community. Cora's teaching certificate hung in its place of honor, but beside it now hung a new document, a commendation from the territorial governor recognizing her courage in exposing the conspiracy that had plagued their region for over 2 decades. Margaret sat at the head table, her face glowing with happiness for her sister's newfound joy. The months since the confrontation had healed the distance between them, and Margaret had decided to remain in Dust Creek to help rebuild the community she had once fled. She had taken over management of the general store when Mrs. Patterson decided to retire, and her business sense was already showing promising results. "I never thought I'd see you smile like that again," Margaret said, squeezing Cora's hand during a quiet moment between toasts and well-wishes. "I thought I'd forgotten how," Cora admitted. "But it turns out some things you never really lose. They just wait for the right moment to return." As the evening progressed, Dallas found himself standing outside the schoolhouse, looking up at the stars that shone bright and clear in the Montana sky. The weight of his father's pocket watch felt comfortable in his vest pocket, its familiar, ticking marking time that now moved toward future rather than away from past. Tom Henderson joined him in the cool night air, a glass of punch in his hand and a satisfied expression on his weathered face. "Hard to believe it's all over." "Is it over?" Dallas asked. "Seems to me like it's just beginning." "Fair point. The Henderson farm is producing again. The Crowleys are building their new house, and the Bishops have enough cattle to make a real go of ranching. First time in 20 years, this valley has felt like home instead of a battleground. What about you? Any thoughts of settling down, starting a family?" Tom smiled and nodded toward the schoolhouse, where a young woman with auburn hair and laughing eyes was helping to serve cake to the wedding guests. "Sarah Patterson and I have been talking. Figure it's about time this valley had some new children to fill that schoolhouse. And who's going to teach them? Cora's going to be busy being a marshal's wife. She's not giving up teaching. Says a community needs both law and education to thrive, and she intends to provide both." Tom raised his glass in a toast to new beginnings and old friendships, to promises kept and justice served. They drank in companionable silence, 2 men who had found their way through darkness to something approaching peace. Around them, the sounds of celebration continued, laughter and music and the voices of people who had rediscovered hope. Inside the schoolhouse, Cora sat at her old desk, now pushed aside to make room for the wedding reception. In her hands, she held 2 letters, Thomas's final words to her and her own unfinished warning to him. Both had been returned to her after the trial, evidence no longer needed for legal proceedings, but invaluable as reminders of the power of love and the importance of speaking truth, even when it was difficult to hear. "What are you thinking about?" Dallas asked, settling into the chair beside her. "About second chances. About the courage it takes to open your heart after it's been broken. About the difference between living and just surviving. Any regrets?" Cora looked around the schoolhouse, seeing the faces of people she had taught and served and fought alongside. She saw Margaret laughing with Mrs. Patterson, Tom Henderson stealing glances at young Sarah, the Crowley brothers playing fiddle music for the dancing couples. She saw a community that had been wounded but not destroyed, people who had found the strength to rebuild what had been taken from them. "No regrets," she said firmly. "Only gratitude for the chance to learn that some wounds do heal and some love stories get second chapters." Dallas took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, as they watched their friends and neighbors celebrate the victory of hope over despair, of justice over corruption, of love over fear. "What happens now?" Cora asked. "Now we live," Dallas said simply. "We wake up each morning grateful for another day together. We serve this community and protect the people who trusted us with their futures. We remember the past without being bound by it, and we build something better for the generations that come after us." Outside, the Montana wind carried the scent of sage and promise across the prairie. Stars wheeled overhead in patterns that had guided travelers and lovers and dreamers for countless generations. And in a small schoolhouse in a valley called Dust Creek, two people who had found each other in the darkest of circumstances danced slowly to music that spoke of endings and beginnings, of loss and recovery, of the endless human capacity to love. Again, the letter from Thomas lay on the desk beside them, its words a blessing rather than a burden. "Be happy, my darling. Live fully. Do not let my death become a prison for your heart." Finally, after 22 years of sorrow and solitude, Cora Elwood Kane was ready to live.